artist from Temple, Maine, Connie Canny, is exhibiting outrageous, courageous women. She is an activist and spent a lot of time in Nicaragua and Cuba, and a lot of the portraits are of women who she met through activism, and Helen is embodied there as well. And tonight we have another artist, Rob Shetterly, also a local Maine artist. He is an activist and painter of the renowned series of portraits, Americans Who Tell the Truth, and he's going to talk about some of his recent portraits tonight.
Good. Thank you very much, and thanks Holly, thanks Greg, thanks Warren, thank you all for inviting me. I'm really very pleased to be here tonight to be able to talk about this. What I did was, often I go places and talk about particular themes, civil rights, environmental stuff, women's issues, gender, whatever. I painted a lot of portraits around many different issues. But I thought tonight I'd just bring my 8 most recent portraits and tell you a little bit about who these people are. Some of these, I think 4 or 5 of these have not been shown at all yet. They're not even up on my website. So I'm happy to show them for the first time and talk a little bit about them. I think what I'll do, though, is because, probably some of you have not heard me talk about this before and have no particular idea, who I am or why I'm painting these pictures or what I mean by Americans Who Tell the Truth or any of that stuff. I'll give you just a short background. And by the way, if you have questions at any point, please don't wait till the end of this. Just ask me. I would.
Sorry to interrupt, Rob. Is there any way to move? People's heads are blocking the portrait. Is there any way to move?
Well, I'll tell you what I can do is when I talk about each one, I'll put them right up here. And so I'll just talk in general for a second. This portrait series was not something I wanted to do. I had a career as a very different kind of artist. I'm a self-taught artist. I taught myself how to draw and paint when I was living in the woods in Gouldsboro in the early 1970s by kerosene light at night after digging clams all day. That was what I was doing. And I eventually developed a voice, as some of you will remember, maybe as a surrealist, and also I did the editorial page drawings for the Maine Times newspaper for a lot of years. My drawings and paintings were often kind of topical, but they were mysterious and ambiguous, and I also thought that I was doing the work that I should be doing as an artist, by especially delving into the mysteries and ambiguities of our lives and our motivations for the things we do. That all changed right after 9/11, and it really wasn't so much 9/11 that changed me at all. It was the use of 9/11 as propaganda to start the Iraq War. I just went kind of berserk. Maybe berserk is not quite the right word, but I don't know, maybe Gail would say, yeah, that's the right word. I did a lot of ranting. We were preparing the ground, within hours after 9/11 to, commit a war crime. And it was for those of us who had spent time, paying some attention to the history of this country and the way we get into wars like that, and the way the media allows it to happen and then encourages it. I'd seen this too many times, and I thought either we actually talked about leaving the country, or become a better citizen, a full-time citizen, by aggressively resisting what was going on to the best of my ability. And in this case, it meant using the thing I do best, which is painting. At this time, I also did a lot of civil disobedience. I went to protests. I did a lot of stuff. But the main thing was to find a way to use painting to resist what was happening. The big question for me was how to do that. I had made pictures for years that often showed a very kind of aggressive nature in reaction to all kinds of issues, and I had learned that just showing somebody that you're angry, or showing somebody that you're full of grief, doesn't really do much. It doesn't. Most people don't want to see that. There had to be some other way to use the energy of anger to do something positive, use that energy in the service of love and admiration rather than in destruction and criticism, even though, of course, there was a lot of criticism implied in what I was doing. And it took me several months to figure out what in the world to do that would allow me to use the painting and make a positive energy out of anger. And I should say that, you know, that anger was, I mean, it wasn't just anger. I mean, it was what, at least I like to think it was, what Terry Tempest Williams calls sacred rage. You know, there was an enormous injustice about to happen, which did happen, and I was full of grief, you know, anticipatory grief about all the victims that were going to be, and how this would also shape our history for years to come. And I just thought, you know, I can't live with this. I was literally making myself very unhealthy because I was feeling wasn't having the appropriate outlet for the anger and the grief. So then the answer became very simple what to do, and really, in a way, was instead of stew about, you know, Dick Cheney and George Bush one more day and let them occupy my mind and heart the way they occupied the minds and hearts of so many of us, was to start surrounding myself with people I admired. And it was very simple. And do it by painting their portraits and scratching their words into it. What I had no idea was the journey it would take me on. I mean, I was thinking, well, okay, I'll do this for a few months, a few years. I mean, I had this goal of painting 50 portraits. I was going to call them Americans Who Tell the Truth. And then my idea was I would give it all away. That made it somehow feel right to me that I was going to be painting pictures of people who had given an awful lot of their lives to trying to make us a more honest society, to make us live up to our own ideals, to make us walk our own talk. And so it felt wrong to me to even think about selling them. The right thing to do was eventually to just give them all away. It wasn't a real good economic plan, but it was emotionally it felt right. It turned out to be okay. So I began this journey, and I was aware of American history, like a lot of you are. Probably a lot of you know more than I do. A little bit anyway. I'd studied, I'd read, I was active in politics. But it turned out that when you really came down to it, I really didn't know much of anything about the real lives of people. And if you said, okay, tell me about the life of Frederick Douglass. I said, gee, what a great guy. He was a slave, and then he was an abolitionist, and a great speaker, and then what? Or Susan B. Anthony. Well, look what she did for women's suffrage, and she was an old crone. I just didn't, I knew these icons, and I knew the names, and I knew the issue, but as far as, where they drew their courage from, what the obstacles in their life were, what the decisions they were made, what kind of perseverance they, had to have, what objections were made to them, how they had to keep fighting the things that happened, to them. I didn't know that stuff. And so this is, all of a sudden I was reading all these biographies and following the lives of people, and it was extraordinary. And I encourage all of you to look at our history that way, through the lives of particular people. So I started with all these 19th century figures. I painted, I think the first painting was Walt Whitman, probably the greatest little D Democrat we've ever had, who believed that not just all people, but every created thing was essentially equal. And until we learned that, we were in trouble. And we all know that's true, actually. He understood that as a poet 150 years ago. And then I painted Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Mother Jones, Jane Addams, on and on and on, all these 19th century figures that most of us know a little bit about. And then, started to just through the history I was reading, find all these other people and all these other stories that I had knew nothing about. And it was an amazing time. I was just thrilled to be learning, I guess more than anything else, the history of courage, moral courage in this country. Because I think if you were to try to put a name, say, on what makes a country have some nobility, what it really is, I think, and maybe this is particularly about our country, but I don't think so. I think it's about any country who tries to shape its social structure and its politics by adherence to some beliefs and ideals that are ennobling to the individual. That what the nobility derives from is the people who insist on it, the people who try to make it real for everyone. It doesn't come from how big your military is. It comes from how much your own citizens care about the ideals that you claim to believe in. And we've always had a big problem there, where we've always given great lip service to those ideals, the greatest democracy on earth, et cetera, et cetera. But we've also made a general practice of excluding large numbers of people, sometimes a majority of people, from actually being able to partake of those ideals. So how does that happen? How does it change? It doesn't change because the elite people, the white people of power, wake up and say, oh my gosh, we forgot to free the slaves. It doesn't happen that way. We forgot to give women rights. It happens because marginalized people insist on it. And it's those marginalized people who become the heroes of our country then. So, my goal, I said, was to paint 50 portraits. And in a very short time, actually, about 2.5 years, I had 50 portraits. It was amazing. I was in a white heat. I was in a real mission to do this, and nobody was paying much attention. And I was spending, every couple of weeks, I was researching and painting another portrait. Then things began to change for me. I started to get invited to go places and talk about what I was doing, which was not, I hadn't anticipated that at all. That all came as a complete surprise. But it has now become my life, really, is using these portraits as models of citizenship, to try to present, what a good citizen can do and does do in a society to actually change issues of social, economic, and environmental justice. So now I've painted like 220 of these portraits. I haven't even counted recently, but there's a lot of them. And I can't stop. It's an obsessive compulsive problem. And the problem is I keep finding, all these amazing new stories. And there are, one of the things that happens to me in an awful lot of schools is, when you tell stories about people who have changed this country's history, and people who are not talked about in the history books, generally not taught. The first reaction of a lot of people is anger. Why aren't we taught these things? I mean, these are the people who would actually change our lives if we were to model ourselves on them. And of course, that's a whole other discussion, is why we aren't taught an awful lot of the most inspiring people, the most courageous people in our own history. How history has often turned, on people who aren't even mentioned in our history books. Bayard Rustin. How many of you people in here know a little bit about Bayard Rustin? A few. That's good. I mean, it's a few. But also, I can't tell you that a year ago I could have told you a whole lot about Bayard Rustin myself. And I knew the name. I'd read histories of Martin Luther King that would mention Bayard Rustin. But I didn't know a lot about him. Right now, I've read a biography. I've read other books about him. I'm reading his letters. If you ever feel like it and have time, Bayard Rustin's letters are a treasury of understanding that period of the sort of late 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s of civil rights, peace activists, and labor history in this country, because he worked very deeply in all of those movements. He was born in 1912 in Westchester, Pennsylvania. From a his mother was 16. She abandoned him. He never knew his father. He was raised by his grandparents until he was a teenager. He didn't know that they weren't his parents. He called them, mom and dad. Finally, they told him the truth. I don't think he ever really knew his mother either. But he never even met his father. He was exceptionally. Westchester was had a fairly large black population, but it was a pretty well segregated town. But when he went to high school, he had to go to a white high school. It was the only high school there was, and he was a big star there. He was a sports star, and he also could sing amazingly well. I mean, he could have had a career his whole life in just singing. And so, people had a lot of admiration for him, and he was also incredibly smart. And when he went to go to college, the only colleges he could go to were black colleges. So he went to Wilberforce out in Ohio, and he got kicked out for organizing a demonstration against the quality of the food in the school. That was one reason, they said. And the other reason may have been that he had an affair with the president's son. I mean, he was gay. And he admitted from a very early age that he was, he knew, and he also was not ashamed of it. That fact, though, had a lot to do with how he was treated in the civil rights movement and why a lot of people wouldn't necessarily know about him today. The March on Washington. Everybody knows about the March on Washington, right? Who organized the March on Washington? Bayard Rustin organized the March on Washington. He was the guy behind that, but he was always kept in the background. He, during World War II, he went to jail as a pacifist. He went sentenced to 3 years in prison for refusing to fight in World War II. I mean, whenever there was an ideal for him, he believed you had to do exactly, act it out. You couldn't compromise on that ideal. He was involved with A. Philip Randolph and the union for, what was it called, the sleeping car porters. And A. Philip Randolph became sort of a father figure for him and taught him an awful lot about organizing. And through A. Philip Randolph, he began to understand that in order for civil rights to really work, if it weren't the fight had to be not just about political rights, but it had to be about economic rights. That unless black people were given economic rights, the political rights weren't really going to matter. And that's why the March on Washington, if some of you remember, was called a March for Jobs and Freedom. It was about, the economics. That it wasn't just about getting the vote. It was about getting, jobs that paid a decent salary. And also, Bayard was way ahead of his time in some respects in the black community for realizing that the only way this was probably going to happen was that if we fought for better jobs for white people too. Otherwise, they were going to be used, as so often happened in this country when one group or another, tried to fight for a particular set of rights, is they were played off against each other. And so everybody lost. And his thing was, we've got to fight for white people at the same time. And this was, again, way ahead of his time. 1947, I'm sort of jumping back and forth here. In 1947, you know about the Freedom Riders in John Lewis and the Freedom Riders going to the South, 1960, 61, and all those, the lunch counter sit-ins and stuff. 1947, they had it was called Journey of Reconciliation, and a mixed group of white and black men took buses down into the South and went all around. He was arrested for that and was sentenced to a chain gang at hard labor in Alabama. I mean, it was just, a lot of these things that he was doing were way ahead of the time, and we only know about the ones that happened later. But this is also a theme that is repeated frequently in our history, is that we know about the ones who were sort of more famous later on, and the people who sort of broke the ground earlier on are not talked about. His image changed enormously, though, after the March on Washington. He decided that the time of protest was over, and it was time to work within the system. And he wrote this great essay, not everybody would call it great, especially at the time, where he said, we need to stop protesting, we need to start moving into the system and make political change that way. A lot of people he'd worked with in the civil rights movement felt that he had sold out. And it changed the way he was seen at that time, and must have been incredibly hard for him to be having his own friends say, you're all wrong, you've done a terrible thing, because in order for him to, he wanted to work with, say, Lyndon Johnson on getting the Civil Rights Act. In order to do that, I mean, here was a man who was a pacifist. He had to not talk about the Vietnam War and Lyndon Johnson's, what he was doing with the Vietnam War. And a lot of people thought, oh my God, Bayard, how could you do that? But he was trying to play the inside game. And, if he had to do it all over again, I don't know if he'd do that. But that was the way he thought about it. And some of you may remember in 1964 in Johnson's convention when Bob Moses and Fannie Lou Hamer had organized the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, to challenge the all-white Democratic delegation that had come from Mississippi. This was an amazing moment in our history. This black delegation came from Mississippi and said, we want to be seated, And it was full of all these incredible idealists who had been fighting really hard for the first time in their lives to be citizens of this country and to be recognized. And it looked like they were going to be seated, but Johnson did not want them seated because he was terrified that if they got seated, he might lose the vote of the South and might lose the election, and we'd have Barry Goldwater. Sounds kind of similar to some more weird thing. Anyway, so what happened was he played real hardball with a lot of powerful civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King, Walter Reuther of the UAW, and people like Bayard Rustin. And he said, you've got to stop these people. You've got to stop, Bob Moses and Fannie Lou Hamer in the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. I don't want them seated. And they actually agreed to it. They actually did it. And for that, a lot of other civil rights people, people like Bob Moses said, oh my God, you sold us out, Bayard. But his idea was, what he was thinking was, we have to, in order to get some things, we have to compromise on other things. And, it's that lesser of evils kind of argument that we're dealing with today. But it was one other story just about his gayness. In 1960, so 3 years before the March on Washington, at Jack Kennedy's convention and at Richard Nixon's convention, the Republican and Democratic conventions, the civil rights movement with the SNCC and the SCLC and CORE and the Urban League had all gotten together, and they were going to do these big civil rights demonstrations at the conventions to try to force whoever became president to be more active about civil rights. The Democrats did not want a big, civil rights demonstration outside their convention. I'm sure the Republicans didn't want it either, but they probably didn't care. That wasn't their thing. But the Democrats felt that they would be embarrassed by it. The way they stopped this demonstration, which was also being organized by Bayard Rustin, was for Adam Clayton Powell, who was the black congressman from Harlem, to call up Martin Luther King and say, either you call off the demonstrations or we're going to spread a rumor that you and Bayard Rustin are having an affair. No, this is true. This is what's true. And, King was so frightened of the publicity that might happen because of this. He was already being wiretapped by J. Edgar Hoover, who was finding out all this stuff and, telling the press about his own, sexual activities and things. He thought this would just destroy him. And so, he got in touch with Bayard and said, okay, we're going to call it off. And, talk about betrayals and sellouts and stuff. That's the kind of games that were being played. But the thing is, the guy never gave up. After the Vietnam War, it was Bayard Rustin who spent an enormous amount of time trying to get refugees from Vietnam admitted to this country. And he was actually very successful, more successful than practically anybody else. He traveled all over the world as a sort of a goodwill ambassador, and working particularly with refugees and all kinds of other dispossessed people. It's just a very complicated history, and a man who had enormous talents. Let's see. I won't talk this long about every one of these. Oh, the quote. Yeah. Okay. He says, first, what is the dynamic idea of our time? It's the quest for human dignity, expressed in many ways. Self-determination, freedom from bigotry, and equality of opportunity. If we want human dignity above all else, we cannot get it while we are on our knees. We cannot get it if we are running away. We cannot get it if we are indifferent and unconcerned. Let's put him over here. So this is kind of an eclectic and motley crew here, folks. A lot of you will, I hope, remember who this woman is. She's still going strong. This is Sister Helen Préjean, the nun from New Orleans, who's the force behind, she wrote the book Dead Man Walking. Some of you remember the movie that was made from that with Susan Sarandon. Well, this is the real woman. She's the woman who's been working for years with people on death row, trying to end the death penalty in this country. And her quote says, "We are all worth more than the worst thing we've ever done." If you've never, or haven't for a long time, read Dead Man Walking, I really encourage it. I mean, it's a thrilling book to read. It's a great book. And it's also and a very emotionally vulnerable and transparent book. I mean, she talks through all the kinds of issues and fears and moral confusions that all of us would have working with some of the people she's worked with, and trying to understand what exactly it is she's doing and why it needs to be done in terms of people who've committed terrible crimes, and why would you want to save their lives, and what does it mean for our society to execute people, and why they shouldn't. Anyway, it's a remarkable book. She's also, I had an opportunity to spend a day with her, when was it, last spring or something, in New Hampshire. She was up here to give a talk, and you spend a few minutes with her and you realize why this woman could so easily get to know and be comfortable with some pretty tough characters. And she's about as earthy as a person can get. I mean, she will be talking about, say something like, "Well, this guy said this," and I said, "Well, kiss my ass," and then she'll, talk about, drinking whiskey with the old boys, under the, cottonwood tree or something. I mean, she's very down to earth, and she's one of the most present people I have ever been with. I mean, she's, when you're talking to her, she's right there. She's really paying attention to what you're saying, and she's thinking critically. I mean, you don't get away with anything talking to her, as I'm sure if you're on death row and trying to make excuses for what you've done, you don't get away with anything. I mean, the whole point of this is making people, or bringing people to understand the cost that they have caused other people, and at the same time, one of the things that she talks about in her book, after having begun this work with people on death row, was that she'd made a mistake of not working with the victims of these crimes and the families of victims, that she had kind of let them go as she got so concerned about the state using its power to execute people. And she started an organization to care for victims' rights and understand victims much better. It changed her outlook a lot about what she was doing, and she started trying to help victims understand what they really felt, and whether taking another life was actually going to change anything for them about the life that's been lost, or the person who's been raped, or whatever it is. Recently, Dead Man Walking has been made into an opera that's going to be performed at the Kennedy Center in January. But just a couple things. I mean, we all know today about mass incarceration and all this kind of stuff. But this death row thing is really extraordinary. It's been proven that 1 out of 9 people on death row is innocent. 1 out of 9. That's not a good average if you start to execute people. And one of the things that her book does, and then also if you're interested in reading more about this, there's a great book now written by a man named Brian Stevenson, head of the Equal Justice Initiative, and he's also in Alabama. who's a lawyer who works with people on death row, who's trying to stop this. There's so many reasons why capital punishment is counterproductive, economically and morally, and in terms of crime. It does nothing to impede crime at all. But it's just the facts around it, and how often, Sister Helen wrote a second book about people she had worked with on death row who she knew were innocent, who were executed. This happens frequently. So I'm going to go on to somebody else here. Her quote is simply, "We are all worth more than the worst thing we've ever done." Yeah, what I do is, with the living people, I go and meet them, and spend a lot of time with them, and then I take a lot of pictures, because they couldn't possibly pose for me for the length of time that I would like them to. This is a portrait like none other I've ever made, and the tone and everything about it is different. When I was I do a lot of work at Syracuse University, which is another whole story, but I was there this last spring, and this man I work with, I told you, can you see them? I can put them up here.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, at least for a moment.
Yeah, I'll hold it up here.
Thank you.
So this is Becky Ingram, and I was told this story by a man named Jim Clark, who's the head of the Visual and Performing Arts Center there at department, about two teachers who were teaching in the drama department, who were originally English, who moved to this country actually because of her. So they had this daughter who had Down syndrome, and their doctor in England had said, why don't you just put her in an institution right away and then have another child and try to forget about this. And they didn't want to do that. And they also had heard that special education was better in the United States than it was in England. And so they moved here. And first they moved to Western Massachusetts, Lenox, Massachusetts, they were Shakespearean actors and teachers. And by the time Becky was about 10, she was insisting on going to all of their rehearsals. She would sit for hours and hours and watch them rehearse Shakespeare. And then she would come home and write her own version of Shakespeare's plays, which was a pretty extraordinary thing to do, but she just loved the theater. And this developed into something extraordinary a year or so later. They got hired then, and they moved from Massachusetts to Syracuse to teach there, and they lived on a street called Buckingham Street. At this point, Becky's about 12, and she was writing her plays, and she started going around the neighborhood and knocking on people's doors and saying, I've written Hamlet, and I need somebody to play Gertrude, and you're going to be Gertrude. And she would collect the entire cast that way from the neighbors and say, Saturday afternoon, you're all going to come over, and we're going to rehearse it. She was directing, starring in it, and also, doing the whole works. And they would all these people would come, and a lot of them were Syracuse professors and their kids and everything. And she called them the Buckingham Players, after the name of the street. And she ended up writing over 80 plays in which a lot of the neighbors performed in. Everybody loved it. A graduate student in theater at Syracuse saw what was going on and said, we can start a program here of theater for the disabled. And, nobody was doing that at that point. And so they, got in touch with Becky, and they sort of modeled this program on her enthusiasm for theater, seeing how much it had changed her life. She, like most kids with Down syndrome or those kinds of disabilities, had been bullied. She'd been treated very cruelly by both adults and children. She had had a very rough go in a lot of ways. But in the theater, she felt totally free and completely creative. So through Syracuse, they started something called the All-Star Cast, which proliferated. There are now 5 all-star cast theaters in New York City. There are 4 in Syracuse. There's one in Seattle. There's one in Chicago. All based on the enthusiasm of this one kid. Pretty remarkable. I mean, it's like, here's a kid with Down syndrome who's done what an activist dream would be, you know, to have that a big effect on the way people behave and what they do. And also, and I'm going to talk about this again in a second with a different portrait. You know, but the thing we want, I would say that, you know, the first goal of education, you know, is not to develop people who can succeed in a global economy. You know, the first goal of education is develop people who know themselves well and can find some outlet for the passions that they feel, and feel, you know, find a way to be in the most deeply way they could be themselves. She's a great example of that, who with her enormous passion for theater, you know, had a huge effect on other people and the way they behaved. And she wrote quite a long poem about what it was like to be Becky and her trials. I mean, she talked about people who had mistreated her as not being bad people, but being ignorant people. And it was her job to try to educate them about people with disabilities. But these are the first couple lines from her poem. She says, "I have a dream that can open your eyes. I believe that dream never dies. I dream of a world where all people can be free, overweight people and gay people and people like me." Her parents haven't seen this yet. It's going to be unveiled in Syracuse in September. She's dead now. When she was born, she had a hole in her heart, and her parents were told she would live for 6 months, and she actually lived to be 25, and then she died. But here's I painted, you know, quite a few young people. There have been great moments in our history that have turned on young people. I mean, one of the first young people I painted was Samantha Smith from Maine. And I'm not going to tell these stories now. I painted Claudette Colvin. I painted Barbara Johns. I painted the Alan Jones, Emma Tenayuka. These are just names that probably mean very little to a lot of you. But great things in our history changed because of these people who were teenagers. And here's another one. Some of you in Maine will know who this is. This is Nicole and Jonas Maines. Nicole and Jonas were born identical twin boys. And by the time she was 2 years old, Nicole knew that she was not a boy. And she started telling her parents. I mean, she actually said to her father one time when she was, you know, 2 or 2.5, "Dad, when's my penis going to fall off?" I mean, she knew she was a girl, and she should be a girl, and she didn't want to be a boy. Her identical twin brother, I painted, this is the only double portrait I've done, really, and the reason I did it was because she said that she couldn't have done what she needed to do without his support, that he was, you know, with her all the way, that he was right there at the beginning trying to convince the parents that indeed Nicole, who was then named Wyatt, was a girl, not a boy. He understood that. It was, you know, she was going to middle school in Orono, and when she was refused to use the girls' bathroom. And it was her case that went to the Maine Supreme Court, which changed the law in Maine so that Maine has gender choice bathrooms, unlike some other states in the country. And, you know, this huge battle going all over the place. Maine has got an enlightened policy because of her. She has now become, both of them are freshmen and just finished their first year at Maine universities. I mean, she's at UMO, he's at the University of Maine at Farmington. They're both studying different things, but also both of them are doing drama. They couldn't be more different in terms of personality. I mean, he is very thoughtful, philosophical, kind of slow and careful about the way he thinks. She is a diva. You know, she's loud, she's funny, and also a great public speaker. My organization, Americans Who Tell the Truth, runs an educational program in Maine every year called the Samantha Smith Project, where we challenge middle school kids to do things in the image and the spirit of Samantha Smith. So get engaged in social justice issues and actually work towards solutions outside of the school. And it's actually an amazing success. This year we had Nicole come and be the keynote speaker. And so here's this transgender girl who's 18 as a keynote speaker to 500 middle schoolers. The kids gave her a standing ovation. They were in tears listening to her. But the thing that I think gets them so much about her is because it's not so much about the gender thing. It's about somebody saying, this is who I am, and I'm going to be who I am. And that is a message that, middle school kids love. Nobody's going to tell me who I'm not, that's part of the reason I painted her, is because that insistence of, my life means so much to me that I can't waste it being forced by peer pressure or public pressure or laws or anything else to be somebody I'm not. I've got to do that first before anything else. And she's fierce that way. Let me read these quotes. This is Nicole. I've got quotes from both of them. She says, I realized my gender at the same time my brother did, yet everyone assumed that I didn't know what I was talking about. I couldn't possibly be old enough to make the distinction between whether I was a boy or a girl, yet my twin brother was. And then Jonah says, hate, and an awful lot of hate has been directed at them. Jonah says, hate isn't instinctual, it's learned. We teach our children to share the same ignorance and prejudices as us, and this is how they live on. Teaching a younger generation to love and understand will allow bigotry and hate to pass out of our lives. Actually, Jonas is the first person I painted who said, that's not me, you painted me much more handsome than I am. He is a handsome kid. By the way, there's a really terrific book written about this. Not so much, it's about Nicole, but it's about the whole family and what the family underwent as they tried to come to terms with this situation. Their little girl saying that she was, or a little boy saying she was a girl, and how they dealt with that, both inside the family and also publicly. And it was an ordeal. First the brother understood, and then the mother, and the father was very reluctant at first. He wanted to play catch and football and go hunting with two boys, and he didn't want to have this happen. He is now the most outspoken one in the whole family about transgender relationships and how, and working with parents all over the country to understand this issue and what to do about it. But one of the things that's fascinating in this book, that was written by the science writer for the Washington Post, and is really worth reading, is the science behind this. People like to treat this as though, it's a choice. It isn't a choice. Your gender identity, your physical gender, develops separately from your mental gender. They're two different things. And actually something happens in your brain, or can happen, that switches it from one to the other. And your brains actually have a different structure. A female brain from a male brain. And there's a lot of science being done on this now, and it's absolutely fascinating. Something happened to her. Some environmental trigger caused her brain to develop differently than her brother's, that has female structures rather than male structures. And that's as much as I'm going to try to talk about it right now without having read the book in a while. Yeah?
I don't think the book does bring up the controversial aspect of this, which is not generally discussed, which is that gender-bending chemicals can have that effect.
Well, you mean environmental things?
Yes.
Yeah, right. But not something you take purposely, but because it's just in the environment. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I think she suggests that something's happened. She doesn't, and it's environmental. She doesn't say, we know what it is, because I don't think people do know what it is.
Well, gender-bending chemicals can have the effect of changing gender. I'm talking about various types of industrial chemicals,
Oh yeah, well, but that's
pesticides.
right. Yeah, like atrazine changes the gender of frogs and things like that, and probably may do this in humans. We don't know enough about it. But yes, I'm agreeing with you. Yeah, I mean, we don't. I mean, it's. I think the point of that is that, I mean, first we have a lot more freedom in our society today to talk about this, but we also may have a lot more of it actually, because of just what you're saying, that there are always chemicals in our environment, and it may be having that effect on a lot of people. Let's see. Oh, well, here's somebody a lot of you probably know. This is Naomi Klein. And there are, I think, a few extraordinary voices in the world today. Talking about, not just voices, but also activists, talking about environment and climate, and the relationship to economy and capitalism and what needs to be done and how it can be done. And I suspect a lot of you have read her most recent book, This Changes Everything. The thing that's, I think, so positive about that book and how important it is because it isn't just a book of criticism. It's a book full of ideas about what we can do. How we can actually attack the problem of climate, in a whole series of suggestions about ways to ameliorate, and ways to get involved in, structural changes, and personal changes, but structural changes, because that's what needs to happen, is systemic and structural changes. But the most important thing, I think, on one hand, is facing, which is so. What so much of our culture is, has such a hard time doing, is actually naming the problem, and actually looking squarely at what it is that's causing and driving these issues, and why it's so hard to change. I mean, if most of your economy is based on exploitation of nature, and that exploitation is destroying the very planet we live on, and the people who are doing the exploiting are the people in power who are making the profits from it, it becomes very hard to make the change you need to make. But you've got to face that, and that most of our governments have totally failed in dealing with this issue. They give some lip service to it, but as far as actually doing anything, they're not doing anything. And it's criminal that our governments don't handle this, but that's where we all come in, because we have to force these changes. Our governments are not going to change by themselves. So Naomi says, our economy is at war with many forms of life on Earth, including human life. What climate needs is to avoid collapse is a contraction of humanity's use of resources. What our economic model demands to avoid collapse is unfettered expansion. Only one of these sets of rules can be changed, and it's not the laws of nature. This gets to the heart of, something that's not just about climate and not just about environment. It's about everything to do with all the things that we would, try to embrace under the idea of social and economic justice. And that is that, we have built a society that is in denial of what the reality is of where we live and what our lives depend on, which is the health of the planet we live on. Our whole structure of our society is based on the opposite, is that somehow we are in charge, that we call the shots, that reality is something that we name, not something that nature names. And that is the crux of this, is facing that issue because we have structured, all of our major systems of living. I would tell you this quick story. I painted a man named Oren Lyons. I may know who Oren Lyons is. He's the faith keeper of the Onondaga Nation, basically the chief of the Onondaga Nation. One of the few tribes in this country that has refused to try to do the thing that many tribes have done, like build casinos and find some ways to make, lots of money. Indians are still the poorest segment of our society. It's not like they're making a lot of money. But the Onondaga are still trying to live because of Oren Lyons at the way they have always lived in a relationship with nature. When I went to meet him outside of Syracuse, where the reservation is, the Onondaga reservation is just south of Syracuse, we were talking and he said, we knew. And when he said we, he meant Native people, 5,000 years ago and 5,000 years in the future. And, we knew that when you separated church and state, it could only lead to disaster. And I said, Oren, what are you talking about? You think of in our Constitution, what is more important than the fact that we separated church and state, at least theoretically? He said, look at it this way. He said, your deepest reality has to be the source of your deepest spirituality. Think about that for a second. Your deepest reality has to be the source of your deepest spirituality. Everybody's deepest reality is nature. It's not capitalism. It's not some sort of anything else that we construct. It's our place on this planet and our relationship with nature. That is our deepest reality. And he said, as Native people, what we always did, for us, we honored that. That is our church. Our deepest reality has to be our church. And what you did, all of us, was separate your responsibility from your institutions to your deepest reality. You separated what we would call church and state, and it could only lead to disaster. Anyway, Naomi Klein is coming, to the same conclusion from a different route. But that's what it is. We've got this serious problem here of denial of reality. We live in a never-never land about how we will survive on this planet. You turn on NPR and it's all about economy, and whether we can, how many jobs we've got, and what the stock market is doing, and there isn't an index every day of how many species are being killed, or how much carbon every day more is in the atmosphere, and how much the temperature of the ocean has gone up, and how much more acidified it is, and how much more fresh water is running off of Greenland, and how many species in the ocean are dying, and relating all the storms and events to what's happening here. That is the reality. These are the people we need to pay attention to. In a related portrait, this is, some of you may know Sherri Mitchell. As a matter of fact, has she spoken here? She's a Penobscot Indian. She grew up on Indian Island, and she's an indigenous rights lawyer, actually working all over the world for indigenous rights. And she's also a remarkable voice in trying to bring people together. After I heard one of her talks one time, I went up to her and I said, Sherri, I don't quite get it. How can you, say the things you do and be the person you are and be a native person in this country and not be angry? She says she doesn't project any anger. And she said, well, what the world doesn't need right now is another angry Indian. But she is a very deep Indian, and she's a very insistent one about what needs to be done and how we need to do it. And after I'd heard her talk, I said, I'm going to paint your portrait, and there was something you said which I think I would like to put on it. And so I told her the gist of it, and then she sent me her own statement. But this is: rights and responsibilities cannot be separated. Every right that we stand upon must be balanced by a set of responsibilities. Responsibilities we cannot legitimately make. Wait a minute, let me try that again. Must be balanced by a set of let me start over. Rights and responsibilities cannot be separated. Every right that we stand upon must be balanced by a set of corresponding responsibilities. We cannot legitimately make a demand, and this is the important part. We cannot legitimately make a demand unless we are willing to take responsibility for creating a world where that demand can be met. I mean, that's, we live in a society that a lot of people feel entitled for all kinds of reasons and assume that they have the right to this or the right to that, whether it's political or consumptive. We have all kinds of rights. What we don't have is a corresponding responsibility often. And that's why it's so important what she's talking about here. That we, and I love this thing where she says, if we're going to make a demand, we have to help create the world where that demand can succeed. That means work. That means something we all got to do, rather than just, bitch and moan and talk about it. She's great, by the way, and she's also very available to come and talk. We had her talk at the Reversing Falls in Brooksville last spring. Two more quick ones. I've painted a lot of whistleblowers. And whistleblowers around, government issues, corporate issues, intelligence issues, national security issues, financial things. I mean, just our country has a lot of whistleblowers. You don't often see it in the news for very long, except someone like Edward Snowden, who found a way to make sure that he did get in the news. But most whistleblowers either don't ever quite make it or disappear pretty quickly. Who defends those people? Who defends whistleblowers? Who makes sure that they get a fair shake? This guy. This is Louis Clark. He's the head of the Government Accountability Project, which is not a government agency. It's an agency, a separate agency in Washington, which uses its lawyers to defend whistleblowers. And I had painted a lot of whistleblowers. I had worked with him, and gotten in touch with him when I wanted to be in touch with somebody who I knew was an important whistleblower, but I wanted to paint, and then he would arrange it. And then one time I was doing an event with him, and I realized, man, this is a guy whose portrait I should have painted. He was doing this incredible work and taking huge risks himself to make sure that whistleblowers got defended when nobody else was. And even when they have a pretty good defense, whistleblowers usually lose big time, which is an extraordinary thing, because often the people who are the most important whistleblowers in our society are the people who go into these positions in say the Justice Department or the NSA or some corporation as being the most idealistic. They actually care the most about doing things right, and they are the ones who discover that there's some corruption or there's some hypocrisy or some big serious thing that Americans aren't being told about what's going on, and they're the ones who wrestle, because it's not like they're the only ones who know these things. In almost every one of these agencies or organizations, lots of people know that there's a lot of corruption going on, a lot of lying going on, but they're so intimidated by the structure. And to step out of that and say, it's more important, that my oath was not to my boss, my oath was to the Constitution, my oath was to the American people. I've got to tell the truth. Daniel Ellsberg, who I'm sure most of you remember, is the guy in the Pentagon Papers. He wrestled with that for 5 years, whether he should, tell the truth about what the U.S. was doing in Vietnam when he knew everything and knew that they were actually keeping real records, but then lying to the people about what was really going on and why it was going on, the Gulf of Tonkin and death, the number of people being killed and everything was all a lie, And he realized finally he had to come out and tell the truth. Tom Drake, 5 years before, Edward Snowden blew the whistle about the corruption in the NSA and the unwarranted surveillance. He did what Snowden didn't do, was try to go through channels, and he was destroyed by it. And most of you have never heard of him. But he did the same thing that Snowden did, but was completely shut down because he tried to follow the legal procedures. And when you do that, they crush you. He was charged with the Espionage Act. His life was ruined. He lost his house, he lost his family. He works at an Apple store now. He was one of the top people at the NSA, a genius. And anyway, Snowden watched him and said, this message has to get out. The only way to do it is to find another way around the system. That's why he, went to Hong Kong and then to Russia and all this stuff. It was because he actually cared so much that we know the truth. That we need to know these things. And, you say, a democracy depends on, us knowing what our government is doing. If we, give up that right to know what the government is doing, we've really given up our right to democracy. We're talking about, being condescended to and patronized and also totally manipulated. And that's what that amounts to. And so this guy, so let me just read his quote. Louis Clark. Whistleblowers violate the powerful taboo against speaking up. Even when faced with termination and blacklisting, they shout the truth when the boss demands lies. And that's very important. The boss demands lies. Because that's what goes on inside these organizations. The Government Accountability Project defends these heroes and builds critical support. With help, whistleblowers are less likely to sink beneath the waves their courageous actions have created. And by committing the truth, whistleblowers with both information and fortitude are reshaping our institutions and securing more democratic society. Let me just...
Well, do you know about Mark Hertzog's new book called Bravehearts, which
No.
is the Government Accountability Project?
Oh. Yeah.
I looked up the that website just to see that their timeline lists a variety of these people who have blown the whistle.
Yeah.
I wondered if you were getting ideas from that list.
No, the problem, I've been to, I've often, there's something called the Whistleblower Tour, which the Government Accountability Project runs, which takes whistleblowers to colleges all over the country to tell their stories, let kids know, these things are happening and why and what they should know and all that sort of stuff. And I've gone with them a couple times, with the portraits and stuff. There are some amazing people out there, and most of us, I don't know anything about a lot of them, but, during the housing crisis and the mortgage thing and all that stuff, there was a guy at Countrywide who was a whistleblower at Countrywide, his name I can't remember right now, but he was just, as a person, was kind of destroyed by what would happen to him around that. I painted a man named John Oberg. A lot of us are, really concerned about student debt in this country. Anybody know who John Oberg was? Probably not. I didn't either. I went to this whistleblower thing, and here was this guy who had worked in the Department of Education in Washington and had discovered that billions of taxpayer dollars were being funneled back through the Department of Education to the banks and lending institutions who were providing the money for student loans. They were already making all the interest on these loans, but they had found a way to get billions sent back to them, and then they were taking millions of those dollars and giving them to senators and congressmen so that they didn't close this tiny little loophole which allowed this money to flow back to them. Oberg blew the whistle on this, and has been taking each one of these institutions, one after another, to court. And And he's winning almost every one of these fights, and then he's taking the money he gets and giving it to scholarships for kids. But I mean, that kind of thing, you know, first it doesn't get any attention, and secondly, there's this extraordinary person who's persisted now for years in fighting this battle about, you know, this culture of debt and the way we enslave our own children. Anyway, they're great stories, and there's so many of them, you know, actually. So this is the last guy I want to just talk about. This is Myles Horton. Anybody, doesn't name anything to anybody here? Nope. My friend Steve Kagan in the back raised his hand. You know, sometimes you wonder, I mean, you see a bunch of great activists in the country, and you think, wow, who trained these people? Where did they all come from? You know, did they all just sort of get the idea independently and decide to go act? No, it turns out that this man, back in 1932, Myles Horton, started the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, which was his sole purpose, was to do exactly that, was to begin to train labor organizers, civil rights activists, women's rights activists, you know, because otherwise this wasn't going to happen. And that school is still going today. He died in the 80s or the 90s, I think. Do you remember? I can't remember exactly when he died right now. But and it's the model that he established there is amazing. It's not, you know, what he does is he brings people together from a certain area who've got an issue, and he puts them in a circle, and he says, you know, talk about your issue, talk about options and strategies about what you might do about it, and I will, you know, help this dialogue, but you're going to figure it out. You know, I'm not going to tell you how you're going to solve this problem. You know, you're going to do it. And it's amazing what comes out of that, because it's all about the people themselves, the issues themselves, and the sort of grassroots organizing. Rosa Parks was trained at the Highlander Center. Martin Luther King spent a lot of time at the Highlander Center. A lot of labor organizers in this country went to the Highlander Center. There was a great story about Rosa Parks after she'd been there, I think the second time, and it was still before 1955 and December 1st when she didn't move on the bus. But at the end of the discussions, they would go around the room and say, well, you know, when you get back to Detroit and you get back to Chicago and you get back to Albuquerque, you know, what are you going to do? You know, and everybody says, well, I'm going to organize to do this strike or something, and they all have a different idea about what they're going to do. And they got to Rosa and she said, oh, I don't know, I'll think of something. And there's another, the song, We Shall Overcome, was actually introduced at the Highlander Center. There was at the end of late in the 19th century, there were a couple of songs that were very similar, but they were kind of churchy hymns. And what was his name? Carawan. I can't think of his first name right now. Remember his name? There was a musician who spent a lot of time at the Highlander Center. Pete Seeger came and spent a lot of time there, and it was Pete Seeger who actually shaped that song and made it into what it became. No, it's I can't think of his name. It'll come to me in a minute. Guy Carawan was the musician who was kind of Myles Horton's in-house musician. But Seeger was there all the time, and Seeger took that song and made it into the contemporary version, and he presented it to Martin Luther King and that group that was there for that period. And there's a story that as Martin Luther King was being driven back to Montgomery after, this is probably 1955, early 1956, was being driven back to Montgomery, he's sitting in the back of the car and the driver's in the front, and he starts whistling. And he says, after he whistles a little bit, he said, that's pretty catchy. I mean, of course it became, the song of the civil rights movement. But anyway, let me read Myles Horton's quote. He says, probably the most important thing we do for people is to have them participate in an actual democratic experience, a ripe experience where people are free to talk and make decisions, where there is no discrimination, and where their experience is valued. And this is really important. If you don't value a person's experiences, I don't know how you can value them as a person. And so what he would do, is get these people in a circle to talk about their own experiences in a completely, he was modeling the democracy that, he hopes we're going to live with. Is you all sit together, you talk about your own experience, you talk about how you're going to solve your problems, and then you develop a strategy to go ahead and do it. Together, as a group. There's no hierarchy. And that's, he worked a lot with the great Brazilian educationer, Paulo Freire, about, if we really were serious about democracy in this country, we would institute democratic training of this same sort in our schools and in our workplaces. People would be involved in the decisions that are actually shaping their lives. We wouldn't, give them all these hierarchical structures and then say, oh, well, go out, in your spare time, go out and be a Democrat or act democratically. You've got to model it at every level. And that's the model that he was working with. And he shaped, all of our lives enormously without any of us knowing, for the most part, who he was and what he was up to. But there's some great books about him and about the Highlander Center. It's still operating. And this portrait will actually be unveiled in Tennessee. And we didn't unveil it here right now. You didn't even see it. But it'll be unveiled in Tennessee in October. And then we'll go right to the Highlander Center to do that. Anyways, some questions, comments? Yes?
So you've got so many great stories that you've heard tonight. How are most of them shown? Are they in galleries? Are they for permanent collections?
Well, they mostly go to schools and colleges, churches, some museums. They get shipped all over the country. I mean, people get in touch with me, mostly colleges and schools, and say, we want to have an exhibit around civil rights. And so they will actually rent a whole group of portraits around civil rights issues, or women's rights, or environmental issues. And then they stay there for a while, for a month or two, and then come back, and I usually go there and talk to people about them. But that's the way it works. I mean, if you don't know, there's a terrific website. It's just called AmericansWhoTellTheTruth.org, where you can go and look at all the portraits and read biographies and see the educational programs and all that kind of stuff, and also how to go about getting them if you want an exhibit. Yeah.
How are you doing with your rage and anger these days?
Is there any reason to have any? Oh, well, I try to, one of the important things is to have a sense of humor. But it's I have a lot of, that's an interesting question. I mean, I have a lot of unresolved rage. I mean, every time somebody, including President Obama or something, says something about living in a country that honors the rule of law, I get pretty upset. I mean, and one of the most important things about that is that because we don't live in a country that honors the rule of law, it has the rule of law for some people, and a lot of people don't have to pay any attention to it. It means that our history can't be taught. I mean, when you go into a school today, and I can now say things that 10 years ago I couldn't easily, I said them, but people didn't like it. Today I can say, all of our leaders were lying about Iraq, and they all should be in jail. These are war criminals. You can say that, but our history books are never going to teach that, because there's never been any accountability, and there's not likely to be. I mean, if we had the rule of law, people would be punished, or at least held accountable. At least we'd have truth and reconciliation. We'd have something that actually named the crime, and then our history would tell it. But our history doesn't tell it. about so many things that this country does and is doing and has done. You know, we don't, and our kids then can't be taught it. And so a lot of the things that are said about, they're true things about what is actually done, become speculative, become opinion. You know, instead of facts, you know, oh, that's your opinion that Dick Cheney is a war criminal. It's not my opinion. You know, he is. We hung people. We hung Nazis for doing what he did. And they all did, you know. That's the thing, you know, we can't teach it. We can't write it down. And I have a residual rage for that issue. But it's totally ongoing, you know, I mean, because, you know, when you live in that kind of fantasy land, that you say, well, we live in a country that honors the rule of law, and you patently don't, it reflects an enormous range of issues which you also don't tell the truth about. And so what's going on in this current election reflects an enormous amount of that myth-making, you know, from both parties, about who these people are, what they actually represent, whose money they represent, what will happen because of them, and they are able to get away with totally misrepresenting, you know, who they are and what they stand for, and what it's going to mean to the rest of us to have them elected. I think it's, you know, I mean, if you're not full of rage, you're not paying attention. So, but that doesn't mean you have to act that way. I mean, you have to proceed in a manner that's talks to people, that honors and respects the opinions of people. But when you have a system that becomes as dishonest as this, it's so hard to break through it. I don't know. What do you do?
Thank you, Ron.
Yeah. There you go. We got one more question. Just saying.
One of the most outspoken organizations on environmental issues is public employees for environmental responsibility. Their director in Washington, Jeff Group, has spoken out a number of times, and the director of the New England office, whose name is Kyla Bennett, is an EPA lawyer, herself a biologist, who blew the whistle years ago and had a lot of trouble keeping her job at the EPA as long as she wanted it. And more recently, her organization defended Jonathan Lundgren, who, when he was at USDA, had to fight to keep his research on neonicotinoids in public use.
Send me some of those names, will you? I mean, seriously, yeah, send me some. I mean, I have an incredibly long list of people I'd like to paint, but there might be some good names in there.
Lionized Tyrone Hayes.
No, I've been in. I may. I mean, he's on my list. Tyrone Hayes is a scientist at Berkeley who's been investigating a lot of these gender-bending environmental things like atrazine and stuff like that. Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much.